The confession was supposed to bring closure, but instead it opened a door to an even darker truth. Detective Amanda Walsh had been prepared for many things when she sat across from Bob Vance in that sterile interrogation room in April 2019. She had expected denials, perhaps tears, maybe even anger. But what she wasn't prepared for was the strange glint in his eyes when he leaned forward and whispered the words that would change everything. "Sarah wasn't my first." It was 2:47 a.m. when Vance made that chilling admission, 18 years after his first victim had disappeared into the same Michigan winter that had claimed Sarah Chen. The investigation that was supposed to end with Sarah's murder had just become something far more complex and horrifying. Detective Walsh felt her blood run cold as she realized they weren't just dealing with a killer, they were dealing with someone who had been perfecting his methods for nearly 2 decades. The story that unfolded over the next 6 hours of interrogation would reveal how a family's tragedy was even deeper than anyone had imagined, how a mother's grief had been compounded by a secret she never knew existed, and how the small town of Millbrook had been harboring not just one murderer but a serial killer who had been operating undetected since 2001. Lisa Chen was 19 years old when she vanished from the same snow-covered streets that would claim her younger sister 18 years later. Unlike Sarah's disappearance, which had immediately triggered a massive investigation and media attention, Lisa's vanishing had been treated as a routine runaway case. A young adult who had simply decided to start over somewhere else, far from the prying eyes of small-town life. The assumptions made by investigators in 2001 would prove catastrophically wrong. That if you're following this investigation into how one family endured 2 decades of unimaginable loss, make sure you're subscribed, because what we uncovered about the connection between these sisters will challenge everything you think you know about how evil can hide in plain sight. Lisa had been working the evening shift at Henderson's Market, the same job Sarah would later take during her nursing school years. The parallels between the sisters' lives were eerie. Both had been responsible students, both had worked to help support their widowed mother Linda Chen, and both had possessed the kind of trusting nature that made them vulnerable to predators who wore masks of respectability. The winter of 2001 had been particularly harsh in Millbrook, with temperatures dropping below zero for weeks at a time and snow accumulations that made even simple errands feel like major expeditions. Lisa had adapted to the brutal weather with the resilience that characterized her approach to all of life's challenges, walking to work each evening despite her mother's offers to drive her, insisting that the exercise helped her think through her college coursework and plan for her future. Henderson's Market occupied a corner building on Main Street that had served the community for over 40 years, its fluorescent lights and crowded aisles providing a warm refuge from the bitter cold outside. Mr. Henderson himself was a fixture behind the register, a man who knew every customer by name and extended credit to families struggling through hard times. Lisa had worked there for 8 months, taking pride in her reliability and her ability to calm difficult customers with patience and genuine concern. On the evening of January 23, 2001, Lisa had clocked in at 3 p.m. for what would become her final shift. The store had been busy with customers stocking up on supplies before another predicted snowstorm, and Lisa had worked steadily through the afternoon, helping elderly customers carry groceries to their cars and restocking shelves that seemed to empty as quickly as she could fill them. Her coworker Janet Phillips would later remember Lisa's good mood that day and her excitement about starting spring semester at the community college in just 2 weeks. The books Lisa planned to return to the library that evening were romance novels she had borrowed during winter break, escapist fiction that provided a temporary refuge from the harsh realities of working-class life in rural Michigan. She had read voraciously since childhood, using books as windows to worlds beyond Millbrook's limited horizons. Her mother Linda had encouraged this love of reading, seeing it as a path to opportunities that had been unavailable to her own generation. As 9 p.m. approached, Lisa had begun her closing duties with the systematic efficiency that Mr. Henderson valued in his employees. She counted the register, balanced the books, and helped Janet clean the store for the next day's business. The routine was comforting in its predictability, a set of tasks that allowed her mind to wander to plans for college courses and dreams of a career that would take her far from Michigan's frozen winters. Janet Phillips had offered to give Lisa a ride home that evening, noting the bitter wind that rattled the store's windows and made even short walks feel dangerous. But Lisa had politely declined, explaining that she needed to return library books and that the walk would give her time to think about her upcoming semester. The decision to walk alone on that frigid January night would prove fatal, though neither young woman could have imagined the evil that was waiting in the darkness. The Millbrook Public Library had been built in 1967 with federal funding that reflected the community's commitment to education and self-improvement. Its red brick facade and tall windows projected an image of stability and learning that made it a source of pride for local residents. The building's location on Elm Street positioned it 3 blocks from Henderson's Market, along a route that passed through Millbrook's quiet residential district. The after-hours book return slot had been installed as a convenience for patrons who worked during library hours, allowing them to return materials even when the building was closed. The slot was located on the building's south side, near a service entrance that was shielded from street view by a row of evergreen trees that the garden club had planted to beautify the grounds. The trees' dense foliage created a sense of privacy that the garden club had intended as peaceful, but which provided perfect cover for predatory violence. Security technology in small Michigan towns during 2001 was primitive compared to modern standards. The library had no surveillance cameras, no motion sensors, and no alarm system beyond basic fire and burglar detection that monitored doors and windows after hours. The building relied on its reputation as a safe community gathering place rather than technological security measures to protect patrons and staff. Lisa's walk from Henderson's Market to the library would have taken approximately 8 minutes under normal weather conditions, but the bitter cold and accumulated snow likely extended her journey to 10 or 12 minutes. She would have passed the Methodist church where she had been baptized as a child, the elementary school where she had learned to read, and several houses occupied by families who had known her since birth. The familiar landmarks would have provided comfort during her final moments of freedom. Bob Vance had been drinking at Murphy's Tavern that evening, consuming enough alcohol to lower his inhibitions while sharpening the predatory instincts that had been developing since his teenage years. Vance had noticed Lisa during her previous walks to the library, studying her routine with the patient observation of someone who understood that successful predation required careful planning and timing. His decision to follow her that night was not entirely spontaneous but rather the culmination of weeks of increasingly violent fantasies that alcohol had finally given him the courage to act upon. The weather conditions that evening worked in Vance's favor, as few residents were willing to venture outside unless absolutely necessary. The bitter wind and sub-zero temperatures meant that potential witnesses remained indoors, creating the kind of isolation that predators seek when planning violent crimes. Vance had parked his pickup truck 2 blocks away from the library, choosing a location where it would not be immediately associated with any crimes that might occur in the area. Vance's approach to the library was calculated and deliberate. He used the residential neighborhood's familiar layout to his advantage, moving through backyards and side streets to avoid being seen by anyone who might later remember his presence near the crime scene. His knowledge of Millbrook's geography came from years of living in the community and gave him significant advantages over someone unfamiliar with the area's hiding places and escape routes. The attack occurred near the library's book return slot, where Lisa would have been momentarily vulnerable while fumbling with her library books and keys in the bitter cold. Vance approached from behind, using the evergreen trees as cover until he was close enough to grab Lisa before she could scream or run. The assault was swift and brutal, reflecting both Vance's physical strength and his complete lack of empathy for his victim's suffering. Lisa fought desperately for her life, displaying the same determination and courage that would later characterize her sister Sarah's final moments. She managed to scratch her attacker's face and hands, leaving DNA evidence under her fingernails that would remain undetectable until forensic science advanced enough to analyze such microscopic samples. The defensive wounds on her hands and arms spoke to her refusal to submit passively to violence, even when facing overwhelming odds. The murder weapon was a knife that Vance had taken from his kitchen that morning, not because he had planned to kill anyone, but because he habitually carried weapons when drinking alcohol gave him the courage to act on his violent fantasies. The blade was a common utility knife purchased at Henderson's Market months earlier, creating a bitter irony that would not be apparent until years later when investigators reconstructed the crime and realized that Lisa had probably handled the weapon during her work at the store. Vance's method of controlling his victim during the attack revealed both his physical advantages and his psychological sadism. He used Lisa's own winter scarf to bind her hands, preventing her from effectively fighting back while prolonging the assault to satisfy his need for dominance and control. The scarf would later be found with Lisa's remains, providing crucial forensic evidence that connected the crime to items that could be traced back to Lisa's known possessions. The sexual assault that preceded Lisa's murder was brutal and extended, lasting for nearly an hour while Lisa remained conscious and aware of what was happening to her. Vance's later confession would reveal that he had derived as much satisfaction from his victim's terror and helplessness as from the physical aspects of the crime, suggesting a level of sadism that would become more refined in his later attacks on Sarah. Vance's disposal of Lisa's body revealed the same methodical thinking that would later characterize Sarah's murder, though his techniques were less sophisticated in 2001. He loaded Lisa's corpse into his pickup truck and drove north into the Huron National Forest, where thousands of acres of dense woodland provided perfect concealment for his crimes. The burial site was located approximately 30 miles from Millbrook, along a logging road that few people traveled even during daylight hours. The grave Vance dug was shallow and crude, reflecting his inexperience with body disposal, but the forest's natural processes would prove effective at concealing Lisa's remains for nearly 2 decades. Fallen leaves accumulated each autumn, while spring rains and melting snow gradually settled the disturbed earth until no visible evidence remained of the violence that had occurred there. The location was remote enough that even occasional hunters and hikers never discovered any trace of Lisa's burial site. Lisa Chen's search for her missing daughter began within hours of Lisa's failure to return home from work. Linda had been preparing for bed when she noticed that Lisa's bedroom light was still off and her bed remained unslept. The realization that her punctual daughter was missing sent Linda into a panic that would define the next 18 years of her life. She began calling Lisa's friends and co-workers before venturing out into the bitter cold to search the route between Henderson's Market and their house. The discovery of Lisa's scattered library books near the book return slot created the first evidence that something violent had occurred during her walk home from work. Linda found the romance novels partially buried in snow drift, their pages frozen and damaged by exposure to the harsh weather. The book's condition suggested they had been dropped or thrown rather than simply lost during Lisa's walk, creating the first indication that her disappearance might not have been voluntary. Linda's immediate call to the Millbrook Police Department initiated an investigation that would be hampered by limited resources, investigative inexperience, and assumptions about young adult behavior that prevented detectives from recognizing the signs of foul play. Officer Gary Stevens, who responded to Linda's initial report, was a recent graduate of the police academy with minimal experience in missing person cases and no training in recognizing crime scene evidence. The initial police response to Linda's missing person report reflected the assumptions that law enforcement agencies typically made about young adults who disappeared without obvious evidence of foul play. Detective Ray Morrison, who would later work Sarah's case, conducted a professional but limited investigation based on the belief that Lisa had voluntarily left Millbrook to start over somewhere else. The investigation's focus on finding Lisa alive rather than determining whether she had been murdered would prove to be a critical error that allowed Bob Vance to escape detection. Morrison interviewed Lisa's friends, co-workers, and family members, searching for evidence of personal problems that might motivate a sudden departure. The investigation revealed a responsible young woman with clear goals and strong family ties, but also uncovered the kind of minor teenage conflicts and romantic uncertainties that investigators often interpreted as motivation for flight from small-town life. The assumption that Lisa had run away would persist throughout the investigation. Despite evidence that contradicted this theory, Lisa's boyfriend Kevin Walsh became the investigation's primary focus when Morrison learned about recent tensions in their relationship. Kevin had been pressuring Lisa to transfer to Western Michigan University where he was studying engineering, but Lisa preferred the community college's practical programs and lower costs. The disagreement had led to several arguments that friends and family remembered as more serious than typical teenage relationship drama, but which fell far short of providing motivation for violence. The interrogation of Kevin Walsh consumed significant investigative resources over several weeks, with Morrison bringing the young man in for questioning 3 separate times, hoping to extract a confession or evidence that would explain Lisa's disappearance. Kevin's alibi for the night of January 23 was solid, with dozens of witnesses confirming his presence at a fraternity party in Kalamazoo, but Morrison's suspicions were not easily dispelled, given the statistical likelihood that intimate partners are responsible for violence against young women. Kevin's polygraph examination, administered by a technician from the state police, produced inconclusive results that neither eliminated him as a suspect nor provided evidence of his guilt. The test's ambiguous findings reflected Kevin's emotional distress about Lisa's disappearance rather than any involvement in her fate, but Morrison interpreted the results as additional reason to focus investigative attention on the young man's activities and relationships. The physical evidence from the library crime scene was limited to Lisa's scattered romance novels and some footprints in the snow that had been compromised by Linda's frantic search before police arrived. The books showed no signs of struggle or violence, leading investigators to conclude that Lisa had dropped them accidentally before leaving the area voluntarily. The absence of blood evidence supported their theory that no crime had occurred, though advanced forensic techniques would later reveal microscopic traces of violence that were invisible to 2001 technology. Morrison's canvass of the neighborhood around the library produced no witnesses who had seen or heard anything suspicious during the evening of January 23. The bitter weather had kept most residents indoors, and those who had ventured outside were focused on reaching their destinations quickly rather than observing their surroundings. The lack of witnesses reinforced Morrison's belief that Lisa had left the area voluntarily rather than being forced to leave against her will. The search efforts organized by Lisa Chen and community volunteers covered hundreds of acres around Millbrook during the weeks following Lisa's disappearance. Teams of searchers combed through wooded areas, abandoned buildings and rural properties, looking for any sign that might explain what had happened to the missing teenager. The searches were hampered by harsh weather conditions and the vast amount of terrain that needed to be covered, but they demonstrated the community's commitment to finding Lisa and supporting her family. Morrison's investigation reached its dead end within 6 weeks, when every logical lead had been exhausted and no evidence of foul play had been discovered. Lisa Chen was officially classified as a missing person rather than a crime victim, and her case file was stored in the same basement archive where it would remain untouched until Detective Walsh discovered it 18 years later. The classification as a missing person rather than a homicide victim meant that the case received minimal ongoing attention and resources. Lisa Chen refused to accept the police department's conclusion that her daughter had run away voluntarily. She knew Lisa's character too well to believe that her responsible eldest child would abandon her family without explanation or communication. Lisa began her own investigation using methods that foreshadowed her later obsession with finding Sarah. She created missing person flyers, distributed them throughout the Midwest, and maintained correspondence with law enforcement agencies in dozens of states. The basement of Lisa's house became an informal command center where she collected newspaper clippings, telephone numbers, and correspondence with law enforcement agencies throughout the Midwest. Lisa contacted truck stops, bus stations, and homeless shelters in dozens of cities, hoping to find someone who had seen Lisa or could provide information about her whereabouts. The search consumed Lisa's savings and emotional energy while yielding no concrete results. The annual memorial services that Lisa organized for Lisa, beginning in 2002, were small affairs attended primarily by family members and a few close friends who hadn't forgotten the missing teenager. The community's attention had moved on to other concerns, and Lisa found herself increasingly isolated in her grief and determination to find answers. The memorial services became Lisa's way of keeping Lisa's memory alive while maintaining hope that she might still be found. Lisa's relationship with Detective Morrison deteriorated over the months following Lisa's disappearance, as Morrison's investigation produced no results and he began to suggest that Lisa should accept the possibility that Lisa had chosen to disappear. Lisa's insistence that her daughter was the victim of foul play conflicted with Morrison's professional assessment that no evidence supported this theory. The disagreement created tension that would persist until Morrison's retirement years later. The discovery of Lisa's connection to Sarah's murder came during Detective Walsh's review of Bob Vance's personal effects following his arrest for Sarah's killing. Among Vance's possessions, investigators found a small collection of items that appeared to be trophies from his crimes, including a library card that belonged to Lisa Chen and had been reported lost during the week of her disappearance. The library card was subjected to DNA analysis that revealed both Lisa's genetic material and traces of Bob Vance's saliva. The DNA analysis of Lisa's library card provided the first concrete evidence linking Bob Vance to her disappearance and created probable cause for Detective Walsh to question him about his potential involvement in additional crimes. The discovery prompted Walsh to expand her investigation into other potential victims and examine Vance's activities during the 18 years between Lisa and Sarah's deaths. Vance's confession regarding Lisa's murder was more detailed and emotional than his admission of Sarah's killing, possibly because Lisa had been his first victim and her death had carried greater psychological significance for his development as a serial killer. He described the attack with disturbing precision, including details about Lisa's final words and her attempts to negotiate for her life that only her killer could have known. The psychological profile that emerged from Vance's confessions painted a picture of a killer who had used Lisa's murder as a learning experience, studying police investigative techniques and community responses to develop more sophisticated methods for future crimes. Sarah's murder had been the product of 18 years of planning and refinement, built on lessons learned from Lisa's death and the mistakes that had nearly led to his capture in 2001. Vance's description of Lisa's final moments revealed both the brutality of her death and the courage she had shown while fighting for her life. According to his confession, Lisa had remained conscious and defiant until the end, refusing to beg for mercy and telling her attacker that her family would never stop looking for her. The prediction proved prophetic, as Lisa's 18-year search had ultimately contributed to Vance's identification and capture. The search for Lisa's remains required extensive coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies and specialized forensic teams. Bob Vance's memory of the burial location was surprisingly accurate, despite nearly 2 decades of environmental changes and his own advancing age, suggesting that he had visited the site multiple times over the years to ensure that his secret remained hidden. The forest location had changed significantly since 2001, but Vance was able to identify specific landmarks that helped searchers narrow their focus. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the area Vance described revealed soil anomalies consistent with human burial and disturbed earth patterns that had been partially concealed by natural forest processes. The recovery operation required 5 days of careful excavation, conducted by forensic anthropologists who understood the importance of preserving any evidence that might remain after 18 years of exposure to Michigan's harsh climate. The forensic analysis of Lisa's remains confirmed the details of Vance's confession while providing additional evidence about the violence she had endured. Her bones showed defensive fractures consistent with her attempts to ward off knife attacks, and the positioning of her skeleton suggested that she had been buried hastily without the elaborate concealment methods Vance would later use for Sarah. The analysis also revealed that Lisa had been sexually assaulted before her murder, adding another dimension to the horror of her final hours. Lisa Chen's reaction to learning the truth about both of her daughters' deaths was a complex mixture of grief, validation, and devastating loss. The knowledge that her maternal instincts had been correct about Lisa's disappearance provided some comfort, but could not compensate for 18 years of uncertainty and the realization that both of her children had been murdered by the same trusted community member. Linda's worldview was fundamentally altered by the discovery that evil could hide behind such a familiar and seemingly benign facade. The funeral services for Lisa and Sarah Chen were held on consecutive days in September 2019, creating an unprecedented outpouring of community grief and support that highlighted the magnitude of the Chen family's loss. Hundreds of mourners attended both services, including residents who had barely known the sisters but understood that their deaths represented a fundamental violation of small-town trust and safety. The services provided a sense of closure that had been impossible while Lisa's fate remained unknown. Detective Walsh's investigation into potential additional victims continued for months after Vance's death from a heart attack in prison in October 2019. The review of missing person cases and unsolved murders throughout Michigan revealed several instances where young women had disappeared under circumstances that might be connected to Vance's activities, but insufficient evidence existed to definitively link him to other crimes. The possibility that other families were still waiting for answers haunted Walsh's dreams. The Chen sisters' case became a landmark investigation that influenced how law enforcement agencies approach cold cases involving missing persons and suspected serial killers. The case demonstrated the importance of maintaining physical evidence even when cases appear unsolvable and highlighted how advances in forensic technology can eventually unlock secrets that have been hidden for decades. The investigation became a teaching example for police academies and forensic science programs throughout the Midwest. The Memorial Fund established in honor of Lisa and Sarah Chen continues to support programs that provide safety education for young women and resources for families dealing with missing person cases. The fund ensures that the sisters' deaths contribute to preventing similar tragedies while keeping their memory alive in the community where they lived and died. The scholarships provided through the fund have helped dozens of young women pursue higher education opportunities that Lisa and Sarah never had the chance to complete. The impact of the Chen sisters' investigation extends far beyond Millbrook, Michigan, serving as a reminder that every cold case represents someone's loved one and that advances in DNA analysis and investigative techniques continue to provide hope for families who have been waiting years or decades for resolution. The case also highlighted the importance of taking missing person reports seriously, regardless of the victim's age or circumstances. As we conclude this investigation into how one family endured 2 decades of unimaginable loss and how modern forensic science finally delivered justice, we want to hear your thoughts about the connection between Lisa and Sarah's murders. What details stood out to you about how Bob Vance was able to avoid detection for so long, and do you think there might be other victims that haven't yet been identified? Share your theories in the comments below. Subscribe to stay updated on similar cases where DNA technology is providing answers to families who never stopped believing, and hit the notification bell so you never miss when justice finally arrives for the forgotten victims who deserve to be remembered.